Well, we actually had a AD guys here.
Okay,
Oh,
Um,
here you are.
sorry, I noticed when I was looking at, you said we were recording but not video recording.
Right.
This is the video.
Oh, it's video.
Yeah, that's what the license is. It's a high-def video camera. We have everything's that wall up there. And then it does, it's patched into the computer, so whatever you're displaying up here is displayed on the video.
Okay, and that, even though I changed the,
Oh, no, that's fine. We were under the impression you might switch computers, but that's totally fine. It still comes up. As
yeah, we
video.
weren't sure, I wasn't sure yet who was gonna bring what, that's why.
so I just had my, I just had my own laptop, I just changed the.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. Whatever feed it's getting, it just throws it into, when someone's watching it, they can just switch between the two. I believe the recording is a recording of both. So you get the presentation recording and our high-def camera.
Oh, fantastic.
Okay.
Great, thanks so much.
much.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think we actually did some inquiries.
Yeah, we did too, so, yeah, so that's good.
I brought this copy
Oh, okay.
to
Yeah, so I mean.
Yeah.
Hi.
I'm Mary Taylor, I'm assistant. And I was gonna ask you to sign this.
Okay.
It's not sign your life away, but only
my first one.
your voice, right, exactly, only one of your children. And it's basically permitting us to record the event and post it on the website.
Oh, okay, cool. Just the audio, right?
No, it's actually
It's
both.
actually both,
Oh,
it's being
great.
live streamed, yeah.
So it's, the
Today is the
18th, right?
18th, yeah. Excellent.
318. There you go.
Thanks.
And you can send the check to, should I give you an address?
If only I had a check.
Oh, well, it's worth a try.
It always is.
We actually called her out. We weren't sure whether it was going to be better.
Right,
And so,
right.
it turns out, I was like, oh, so I should,
Right.
big box, right? Yeah, so,
Yeah. But yeah, so does that, but as I said, you know, I just didn't want that to be.
I understood, of course, all of this is recorded.
Right,
No,
but
no.
it's the event, you know, outside
Yeah.
the room in front.
No, I-
So the other thing you could do, if you wanted to, is look up these I'm actually have to walk out of here to come live. But if you want to do that, you know, you're welcome to just. Sure. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
we
just
have
so
three
you know.
copies, we made, I think we have
You
three
made
copies,
it.
we made us take one,
Yeah.
we have not one yet.
Right, yeah. And then.
Thanks.
I mean, I'm not saying watch until 5, but
Yeah.
I'm not really, you know, a fan of ceremony. I'm happy to do it if you want me to. Yeah.
Need to have all our credentials.
Right, okay, so then, yeah.
Wait, in fact, I don't even know them, all I know is that Jeff teaches at NYU.
If you wanted to.
Right, I couldn't do it if I wanted to. You know, I'll say something like, right, Jeff, I don't need to like do a fancy announcement, right?
It's not.
He teaches at NYU. He's written a bunch of books.
Isn't there a, is there a flyer for this event you could read from? There was a flyer
I can-
with little bios.
Access it online, because I didn't print a copy of it, the bios are on the flood.
The bios are on the, I'll send it to you. Show you that?
My
What?
phone?
What?
My phone, you mean?
No.
I don't have a
We can bring it up on this one right here.
Oh, right.
Read it from that computer.
That way you won't mess up your.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see.
Right, so
Brilliant.
just go to the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics.
In all seriousness, is there any way for me to like go off the premises and buy one of these copies and I still have it? Like, can I pay you for it?
But I don't even know how, I guess it's, yeah, I was gonna say, you can try how much it is, but
There's another person joining you, right? There's
Yeah,
another
Lawrence.
speaker. So I'm gonna stick this here for Lawrence, just so I don't.
Okay.
I came home today and I get them since,
gotcha. Yeah, that's fine.
since I.
I'll, you know what? How about this? I'm filming it. Yeah, you don't have. Alright, okay. That, you know, I actually think that'd be awesome. It was so much fun. It was like one of those, it was one of those.
You guys are good smart. In the couch. One of us.
But you're not at all.
Yeah, this is now.
Okay. No, it's funny, I totally forgot. Hello. Oh, yeah.
I just actually only want the right to record you at
Sure.
the event and post it on the center's site.
Brilliant.
We need to make this legal after all.
Yeah, we've got
I
to
don't
be
want any
responsible
Marxists
as
coming
well.
after me, you know, so down the road.
That can happen. We funded a whole guerrilla war one time. Yes. That does look nice.
It's fine, we're starting, you know, we have 10 minutes before we're gonna start anyway.
How long are you in the States for?
Just for a week.
Weeks?
Yeah. We're visiting my sister in Brooklyn, so
Where?
we're visiting my sister in Brooklyn.
In
So
Brooklyn, I see.
this is the hidden interest.
Sounds like a good reason as any.
If I do talk, my university will let
There you go, it's a business trip.
It's suddenly a lucrative, yeah. Everything's with you.
When we'll, I mean,
Are you in break now?
I'm gonna have to,
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
gonna have to get some,
Me
these
too.
are the,
You coming out with us after this?
but when we do,
John and myself and whoever else are going for something to drink or eat.
Oh, afterwards?
subsequently.
I'm afraid I can't join you. I have to head home.
It is
But
what
have
it
one
is.
on me.
I will. We'll put that over there, 'cause I don't think we're gonna have anybody's.
I thought I would say something pretty brief about the genesis of the book. Then I think have you, Jeff, go, then me, then Lawrence. Does that make sense? Is that all right?
That works absolutely. I
Okay,
you-
sort of, what? Do I what?
was going to say, when you introduce it, do you want to invite people to come and join us for a drink afterwards?
Sure, could do that. I don't know how big the group will be, but it can't be that big, so yeah, sure.
Exactly.
Right,
It's not
sure.
gonna-
Yeah,
It gives people a chance to think about it.
I think that's right. I
John,
think it's, yes.
you mentioned we should talk for 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Okay. I'm not really sure, but it might go as long as 15. Or actually, maybe as long as 20.
I'm gonna try not to. but
Give
you
me
know
if I go past 15, give me a
Make a
2-minute
sign.
warning
All right.
at 18.
What are you working on at the moment?
Look on terrorism.
Generically, like
Well, some case studies of state and oppositional terrorism. Northern Ireland, Israel, Palestine, South Africa, World War II, Al Qaeda versus the U.S. Yeah. So it's a range of case studies.
a theoretical book, is it, or a teaching book? Or
Yeah, it's kind of, theoretical book, trying to develop a theory. So,
Okay.
and you?
I'm catching my breath.
You've been busy.
Alf and I have just done our Marxism book.
Uh-huh.
So it's with the
What's it
publishers
called?
this week. We make our own history.
Okay.
Thanks to him, he is anonymous reviewer. He said our titles sucked, so we came up with the background.
I won't ask what it was before, but
It was A Material Force, which is a real Alf Nilsson title. You have to know your Marx to get the title, so
I got it.
Yeah.
I kind of like it. Just the reviewer did it.
so
And you have a press for it? Or?
it's coming out in September. So Pluto, yeah.
Pluto.
But they're actually reading it, which is a first for me.
Oh, yeah. You sent it out?
No, they've done that, but the editor's gone, I'm reading it this week. I've never had an editor say that to me before. They've usually got, the reviewers liked it.
I said that the reviewers never read it. It's kind of kicked it out.
Yeah.
See what comes back, if anything. Michelle, hi. Good. Glad you could make it.
I'm teaching free liberation course together.
I saw. So it's now in paperback. Or soon, I guess. Officially,
It may be officially out for all I know.
well, there seems to be some discrepancy between Haymarket and Amazon.
It's not on the Haymarket website as of yesterday, but they
But
may
the
have rectified
Haymarket
that.
flyer says,
Oh, you Jason.
Michelle.
Hi.
Amazon says
Yeah.
June.
Yeah. Who knows? Honestly.
I think if you order directly from Haymarket, they might send it to you.
I think once they've got copies, yeah.
Well, I don't know. I've heard there are strict laws against selling books before
Really?
official dates. Yeah.
That's
I don't
strange.
know. Hey, John.
Just gotta give you a little hug and say, welcome to CUNY.
Before my time.
I know you did. Welcome back.
Not this room. Well, I don't know if performance is the word for what I'm getting for. I didn't even notice. Wow.
That is an extraordinary section.
It's a performance, but there's a stage beyond this.
This I hadn't realised quite what Graduate Centre was. I started Googling.
It's a department store. This was a famous department store
Right.
right across from Empire State Building. And empty for years.
Oh.
Maybe a decade more.
And now it has 4,000 PhD students in it.
And then they, maybe a decade ago, they fixed it up.
Oh.
Became the graduates, the new graduates, which was located nearby.
We have 49 PhD students in my department. We think that's rather low.
Careful what you put up there, John. It's your personal business. still a mess?
Well, the government, the EU, are kind of crossing their fingers and going, let's hope things start to improve, because then the EU can show Ireland off to the rest of Europe and go, see, if you take your medicine, you get better.
Right.
If you don't, you wind up like Greece.
So you've been waiting for the
Well, unfortunately,
investment to kick in.
one of the reasons why Irish people are not more active is that there's a certain logic to saying we're small enough. They're not going to make policy based on what we do, but they might reward us for behaving well. So we're so fun.
Yeah. What's unemployment?
Well, it would be 25% if we didn't have massive immigration. The whole generation is
Yeah.
fucked up. Forgotten. You go to a graduation, everybody's in obscenity.
It's grim.
This is good. It's filling up pieces.
Yeah.
Realized that my notes are on my computer, so I can't do the slideshow and have my notes in front of me. So I'll just, luckily I have the PowerPoint, so I'll just do it. But it'll be fine. I think.
See, this is how we always do things.
Yeah,
You know, when you guys come over and read out your well-prepared things, we think, God, what an incredibly sophisticated.
Oh, really? I always
yeah,
feel like
fluent.
it's such a crutch, and I always feel like all of you guys have just,
We just go, I'd kind of like to talk about something today. I'm not quite sure what.
hardly. All right, maybe should we just get started more or less on time? I think that's probably a good idea.
Your call.
Yeah, I think we can actually get started more or less on time, right? So,
You want to wait a couple minutes for late arrivals?
hi, welcome. My name's John Krinsky. I teach up at City College, and to my left are Lawrence Cox and Jeff Goodwin. I want to welcome you. I think we're just going to pretty much start on time, which is pretty unusual for CUNY, but the room is full enough, so I thought we should give it a go. Today, really what this discussion is about, or prompted by really, is a couple of things. Mainly it's prompted by the publication of a book that Lawrence and I, as well as Colin Barker and Alf Nielsen, co-edited, called Marxism and Social Movements. And so we're going to be talking about pieces of that book as we go along. And then it was also prompted by the lucky occasion that Lawrence is visiting New York, and I thought this would be a good time to actually have a public discussion about this book, which was published last year, but which we haven't had a public discussion about in New York since it was published. And part of the reason is that the hardcover, which is pictured there, is quite expensive. The paperback, which has just come out today, and I don't even know what kind of run it's been given today, is considerably less expensive. And there are order forms on the chairs. You can please order it. We don't have copies to sell here. We're not allowed to actually do private commerce on public property or something like that, which I can understand, because nobody does private commerce on public property, right? So, just a little bit about the genesis of this book. It cooked over the course of a bunch of years. It really started as in the form of discussions at a marvelous conference on movements that Colin Barker, one of our co-editors, puts together in Manchester, in England, in the spring, called Alternative Futures and Popular Protest. And I think it's in its 19th year. I think you were at the first one, right? In
Second.
95. You were at the second one in 95?
Something like that.
So it's about in its 20th year. And it's a marvelous small conference full of actually something that you don't always get when you study social movements in the United States, which is political conversation. And it's political and analytic, and it's just a marvelous, small but dynamic conference. And there have been a lot of presentations over the years that somehow play with the theme of Marxism and social movements. And after a couple of discussions and false starts, we decided that in fact it might be a good idea to sort of draw on some of the networks that came from the conference and other networks as well, and see what we could come up with in terms of an edited volume. As a sort of partially an agenda-setting volume, but also to draw on lots of the different conversations that have been going on. I should also mention that another product of this conference has been a marvelous online journal called Interface that Lawrence helped start, and it was another, I would say, product, at least partial product, of the Alternative Futures and Popular Protest Conference. But of course, so this is actually the picture that's on the conference Facebook page this year. But the real work actually happens in the pub, which is, and this is actually a picture of the pub that is very close to the conference, and that's where the real work of having the initial discussions happened. Then after that, we had a listserv where we just sort of put out this idea of what could this look like, and we had, I don't know, 70 or so people contribute to the discussions on the listserv, and to help us craft a call for papers and contributions. We got that. We got a whole bunch of abstracts. We had a really hard time sifting through which ones we wanted, and then went through the paper. So it took a whole bunch of years to do. And what we ended up with was the book, with a wide range of chapters on theoretical frameworks, on the workings of social movements, on comparative historical perspectives about social movements against neoliberalism. And I think one of the things that I'm happiest with is that the book itself ends up displaying that Marxism isn't just one thing. It isn't that it is capacious enough to sustain debates within it, but it also has contributions about movements from 3 centuries, actually I think maybe 4, and every continent except for Antarctica. And the penguins tend to be fairly peaceful, I think. So yeah, that's what the book is. That's what the book has in it, and I want to plug it, obviously. But what we're going to do today is we're going to have Jeff speak about a chapter that he and Gabe Hetland, who is he still at Berkeley, or did he? So Gabe Hetland, who's a graduate student at Berkeley, wrote on the strange disappearance of capitalism from social movement theory. Then I'm going to talk about the chapter that I wrote that's called Marxism and the Politics of Possibility, and then Lawrence will close by talking about, I think, his several contributions to the book in some sort of synthetic way. And we'll open it up. But before we get on with it, I just wanted to also say that anyone who is free and available to join us for a drink afterwards, we're going to find a place to have a drink, and we can maybe continue the conversation there. Okay, so Jeff Goodwin teaches at NYU, and he's a professor of sociology. He was a recent chair of the Collective Behavior and Social Movement section of the ASA, And he's the author of No Other Way Out, States and Revolutionary Movements, 1945 to 1991, and co-editor with James Jasper, our own CUNY, of Passionate Politics, Emotions and Social Movements, also co-edited by Francesca Paletta, and The Social Movements Reader, and Contention in Context. So, and many articles. So, Jeff, take it away.
Thanks. I should thank John and Lawrence for letting me tag along to this event. As you heard, they are part of the editorial team that put together this impressive volume, and I, by contrast, am a mere contributor to the volume, and as you heard, moreover, I'm a mere co-author of a chapter in the paper, and I should recognize Gabriel Hetland, my co-author, who, as John mentioned, is finishing up his doctoral dissertation at the University of California at Berkeley. And as John also mentioned, the title of the chapter that Gabe and I wrote for this volume is titled The Strange Disappearance of Capitalism from Social Movement Studies. And as that title indicates, it documents how a concern with capitalism and class conflict, which was evident as the field of movement studies coalesced during the 1970s, those concerns had all but disappeared by the 1990s. And ever since, for a quarter century or so, social movement scholarship, at least in the United States, which is the country we're mainly talking about, this scholarship has not regarded capitalism or class struggle as particularly important. There are a few exceptions to this generalization, of course, but the vast majority of movement scholars have, in their attempts to make sense of movements, focused their attention on the supposedly autonomous dynamics of politics, organizations, and networks, and culture, variously conceived, eschewing any consideration of political economy, including but not limited to Marxist political economy. Gabe and I speculate in our chapter that this refusal has just about everything to do with the decline of radical anti-capitalist politics in the US after the 1970s, a development that had profound reverberations in the academy. Certainly, political economy and class analysis have not been ignored by social movement scholars because their research has decisively shown that these are unimportant. Of course, no such body of scholarship exists. Marxist ideas haven't been defeated in the academy so much as slowly marginalized. Now, that said, there are two responses to the claim that social movement studies have ignored capitalism and class conflict, which might be seen to have some basis in movement scholarship, and it's on these responses that I want to focus today. The first claim is that the effects of capitalism are entirely mediated by political, organizational, and cultural factors which are irreducible to economics, such that capitalism itself tells us nothing of importance about movements. The second response is that class may be an important basis of collective action, but it is, after all, only one such basis, and by no means the most important foundation for collective action in post-industrial societies, so-called. These responses, I want to argue, are wrong and grossly exaggerated, respectively. So let's begin with the first. The idea that the effects of capitalism are entirely mediated by political, organizational, and cultural factors runs into two problems, I think. First, even if it were true, this claim by no means rules out the possibility that capitalism severely constrains and limits the range of variation among political, organizational, and cultural factors. This idea, of course, has been central to Marxist accounts of the state, most of which recognize not only the possibility, but indeed the normality of state autonomy under capitalism, but they also emphasize that this autonomy is strictly limited by politicians' dependence upon capitalists for a robust economy, hence upon their investment decisions in order to secure their own, that is, politicians' legitimacy and popularity, not to mention tax revenues for popular state projects like health insurance, social security, and so forth. In addition to this structural power of capital vis-a-vis the state, we know that capitalists are able to mobilize, I suppose especially in this country, massive resources in order to influence directly key politicians and policymakers. Now, this last observation points to the second problem with the claim that capitalism and its effects are mediated. It's clearly wrong. That is to say, there are innumerable ways in which capitalism directly shapes, in unmediated ways, politics and culture. Think not only of how capitalists bribe politicians, but think of how capitalism distributes resources that might be used to sustain collective action. Think of the effects of work on collective identity and working class organization, or the lack thereof. Think of capitalist ownership and control of the mass media. Think of capitalist support for so-called astroturf movements, and so on and so forth. The neglect of such direct connections between the capitalist economy and capitalists on the one hand and politics and culture on the other by movement scholars is, it seems to me, indefensible. And yet our review of the field, the literature, which you can read about in our chapter, shows that in fact, you'll find almost no such analysis in the leading movement journals. So let's turn then to the second justification for ignoring capitalism and class conflict. This is the claim that class may be an important basis of collective action, but it is, after all, only one such basis, and by no means the most important. In fact, social movement studies today might be more accurately called non-labor movement studies. There are some exceptions here, as always, including the work of John Krinsky, but the vast majority of movement scholars, as I'm sure John can attest, not only do not study labor or working class movements, but they seem happy not to think about such movements. Scholars with an interest in the working class or labor movements can always turn to the interdisciplinary labor studies field, and within the profession of sociology in this country, to the labor and labor movements section of the American Sociological Association. In other words, a kind of apartheid wall has grown up between movement studies and labor studies. And this allows movement scholars, I think, to pay lip service to the importance, however limited in their view, of the labor movement and of class conflict, while practically ignoring these altogether. But I don't just want to complain that movement scholars have unjustly ignored labor movements, though they have. Just as importantly, movement scholars' allergy to political economy and class analysis has impoverished their work on racial and ethnic movements, women's movements, and movements of gay, lesbian, and transgendered people. In our chapter in Marxism and Social Movements, Gabe Hetland and I discuss how capitalism and class have mattered for LGBT movements. And we purposely chose to focus on this particular family of so-called new social movements in order to demonstrate the usefulness of political economy and class analysis for understanding putatively non-economic and non-class movements. So if you're interested, do take a look at that analysis in our chapter. But I want to end today by making an even broader claim, or perhaps plea, which is that we need to remember that the great struggles of the past 60 years against discrimination and exclusion and for civil, political, and social rights, I'm talking about struggles by racial and ethnic minorities, by women, by gay and lesbian people, among many others, are struggles that have had a more or less strong class dimension, and which have had as one of their primary effects the partial reform and civilizing of capitalism. These struggles have been driven overwhelmingly by ordinary working class people. They've often targeted capitalists and their political allies, and they have aimed in no small measure to win the right to a decent working life with a decent wage or salary, with the right to unionize, all without discrimination and harassment on the basis of race, gender, nationality, or sexuality.
Thank you, and I want to...
John, I'm actually not done.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, it sounded...
I paused to take it.
Sorry. At any rate, you keep going, but welcome the others. I imagine that what happened is that the room change wasn't completely communicated across all of the places. It happened at the last minute, so for that, I apologize. Go ahead. Sorry, Jeff.
Poorly timed stop for beverage on my part. Yeah. Yeah, I was talking about how these apparently non-class movements, have been, as I said, to a significant extent, really about the right to have a decent working life, a decent wage, without discrimination and harassment in the workplace, as well as beyond the workplace on the basis of race, gender, nationality, or sexuality. And so I simply ask you, if this is not class struggle, I'm not sure what is. Did capitalists just offer up all these things on a silver platter? Now, sure, these struggles have failed to deliver the revolution, but they're no different in this regard than most class struggles. And yes, some of the demands of these movements are for status and recognition and civil equality, non-economic demands, but they are no different in this respect than many class struggles. And if in the course of these struggles some workers have sided with their bosses and have had to be fought against as well, then again, these struggles are no different than many class struggles. I think non-Marxists and Marxists alike make a categorical error when they pigeonhole these movements into boxes marked race, gender, and sexuality, and fail to see their political, economic, and class dimensions. If this hefty volume, Marxism and Social Movements, prevents scholars and students from making this error, it will have served a most useful purpose. Even scholars in the non-labor movements field, in fact, especially scholars in the non-labor movements field, can learn a lot from political economy and class analysis, and I hope they read this book. I am now officially finished. Thank you.
Sorry, Jeff. Again, I want to apologize. We had a room change just at the last minute, and I tried to get word out through all of the networks possible, but we didn't completely manage. So again, I apologize, and I apologize especially to Jeff because not only was he interrupted, but those who came in later didn't get the full benefit of his talk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the chapter that I wrote in the book, and it's called Marxism and the Politics of Possibility. And it really starts with a message of solidarity from protesters in Tahrir Square to the occupiers of the Wisconsin Capitol building that was read out at a solidarity rally in New York. And what I was trying to think about was, how was it that everything in a certain sense was going off at once? And what accounts for these kinds of global conflagrations of movements of struggle. And the way that social movement studies and different social movement theories often handle these questions is piecemeal, really. Right? They will talk about cycles of protest. So they'll talk about waves or cycles or some other such metaphor of growing and ebbing protest that sweeps the world, and there are ways in which they specify that it may be protest can diffuse from one place to another. They can often talk about what they call master frames that are picked up, like civil rights, or the people all start to argue in the language of rights. They'll talk about political opportunity structures or political opportunities, which tend to mean the opening or closing of alliances or the coming together or splitting apart of alliances, usually of elites. And then when these alliances fray, there is opportunity that's created for movements to bubble up and make alliances with pieces of the elites, which then will act solidaristically with their claims to some extent and for some time until the political opportunities pass. There's framing, which has to do with symbolic action, the way that organizers and activists talk about different issues. And then you get into other kinds of theories in the dynamics of contention program that Doug McAdam, Charles Tilley, and Sidney Tarrow developed in 2001. You get things like scale shift, so a composite of explanations about how brokerage works. That is to say, how do well-positioned people or actors help make protest bigger, reach more people, have the effects reach more people. Then there are older theories, but which still carry some weight in the field, having to do with strain, social strain, or electoral changes, this sort of thing. And then there are theories that speak to issues about collective identity, how people may, at a certain point, for example, start to identify themselves as activists. Now, all of these are useful to some degree. Right? The problem is that they tend to be put forward either one at a time, in which case they show themselves to be wildly inadequate to explain what's going on, or they're slapped together, cobbled together without any real attempt at synthesis. Now, so then what we've got is a bunch of difficulties. Now, Jeff spoke about a couple of these. The waning but foundational influence of Marxism. In a lot of in the 60s and 70s, Marxism actually helped shape what we know as the current field of social movement studies, but it and capitalism and political economy has strangely disappeared. There's an avoidance of politics, although there's a great deal of movement scholars will proclaim their political positions. They won't really theorize those political positions as part of their analysis. So they don't actually talk about politics. They talk about politics, I should say they don't actually talk about it. They talk about it in the most superficial ways. It doesn't really enter into the theory itself. There's a lack of synthesis, which I just mentioned, a playing down of economic moments and aspects of protest. And even the sort of newer relational approaches, I think, often don't push hard enough. And I'll say a little bit more about those in a minute. So then I've got, the sort of crux of the paper is 5 concepts, revolves around 5 concepts from Marxism. And I just sort of thought that somehow a Lego minifigure would do the trick for an illustration. And these are totality, contradiction, immanence, coherence, and praxis. And I'll talk about each one. So totality in Marxism should be understood as a dialectical totality. And that is to say, it's a set of relations, of all relations, in which things are temporary and developing moments. That is to say, when we talk about things, whether it's individuals or anything else, we're talking about something that is a congealed set of relations that is developing into something else. I mean, certainly we all are. That applies, I think, very well to people. And explaining this to my 11-year-old son is a trip, but he gets it. Because he realizes, he's at a point in his life even, when he realizes that he's not the same as he was, and he's about to be very different again. So there's something, I think, very important about that. Another thing about totality is totality isn't the same thing as totalizing. And you hear a lot about this in sort of post-structuralist theory and critiques of Marxism, that it's totalizing. It just is a thing that makes everything sucked into its explanation. Everything is political economy, for example. Everything is class. And I don't think that that's what Marxist totality is about at all. Because economic relations themselves are relations that are changing. And they're a moment of a totality where really what you've got is a set of internal relations. That is to say, relations are internal to a totality. They're not a matter of figuring out how a million different unchanging pieces bump into each other or relate to each other. Therefore, too, I think that for social movement theory, search for micro-foundations is bound to be a dead end. That is to say, trying to find the right unit that you can where you can understand how this unit relates to the next unit and how they interact is probably a dead end, because those units are always abstractions from a totality. And you'll see if you read a lot in social movement theory, you'll see that these attempts to either ground social movements in the actions of rational individuals or in different kinds of micro-relations end up being very difficult to sustain, because you always need something, you always need to bring something else, sneak something else in the back door in order to make the explanation work. But similarly, the search for micro-foundations, too, is a problem. That is to say, and there are versions of Marxism, too, that say everything is, in a certain sense, decided from on high, from political economy or class struggle, and it's the overarching thing that makes everything work. And that's a problem, too, because it then suggests that, for example, where you are in the class structure determines everything that you do. And I think that's problematic. It's rather to say that your position in class relations is consequential for what you do, is a very different thing to say. Next, contradiction. Dialectics are about change driven by contradictions in internal relations. And that's a little bit of a mouthful. But what I want to suggest is that it's not just inconsistencies. That is to say, there are loads of inconsistencies, for example, in institutional rules, right? We all know that there are inconsistencies in institutions that make them difficult to navigate, and people get annoyed that they're difficult to navigate, and they may get angry and they may get organized. But that's a little bit different from what I'm talking about. The idea about contradictions in internal relations has to do with things like there's a beautiful statement of it in Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital, which is where he outlines larger theories. But there's a problem, right? When the better capitalists do, that is to say in business, the more likely it is actually, oddly enough, for workers' wages to rise. But to the extent that their wages rise, they're still falling far behind in terms of their ability to control the process. They're falling far behind capital. So there's a contradiction there. In other words, to the extent that you do better, you do worse. There are contradictions, again, also in identity movements, right? There's a question about if we claim, and Josh Gamson has a wonderful essay from 1995 about the gay lesbian, the gay and actually the controversy about gay and queer in San Francisco in the early 90s, where he deals with this, he tackles this question about, well, if you claim an identity all the way, with all your heart, do you run the risk of cementing the very relations that are otherwise oppressive? And so that's when there's this debate between gay and queer, because the proponents of a queer identity were saying, what we want to do is we want to break down these gender norms, not support them. And you get you'll hear some of the same debates, for example, in debates around gay marriage today. Imminence, what does this mean? Imminence is it's actually a term that has religious origins, but in Marxist analysis, it speaks to the real potentials of development. That is to say, once you have contradictions, they can develop in different ways. And one of the questions that you want to ask is, how can they develop? And how can they really develop? Not, how would I love them to develop? That's a different kind of question. And here's a place where the writings of Antonio Gramsci are very important, because he makes a distinct contrast between what he calls realist immanence and or historicist immanence and speculative immanence. And what he's trying to get at is the importance of analysis when you talk about what potentials are. And for movements themselves, this becomes a really important kind of question. So for example, right here I've got a picture of the kitchen at Occupy Wall Street. And one of the things that you could hear a lot about in 2011 was the potentials that were revealed by people living in community, feeding each other, setting up health clinics, looking out for each other, providing security, and all those things are potentials upon which we can really show that we can build a new society. And that's not utterly wrong. It's not utterly wrong. The question is, at this moment, how can these potentials be developed? And if you just say that everybody else who's not interested in developing them right now is selling out, you've converted it from a political analysis to a moral category, and you have not actually understood what those obstacles are in, I think, an adequate enough way. The next, and I'm running through these fairly quickly. I imagine that we can talk about these. Another idea also linked to Gramsci is the idea of coherence. And Peter Thomas, in his historical materialism book series book, The Gramscian Moment, deals with this, I think, quite nicely. Is talking about hegemony as a kind of coherence. That is to say, it's an assemblage of all kinds of relations. There are institutional relations, there are economic relations, there are symbolic relations, and hegemony is the process really of assembling some block of relationships that helps set the agenda or the way of life that we conduct. And I think that that's actually what, in a lot of ways, a lot of movements are trying to do, either on different scales and in bigger or smaller ways. But it's not just symbolic action, and I want to make sure that if we talk about hegemony, we're not just thinking that we're talking about symbolic action or something like good framing. It goes far beyond that, which is part of the reason why, for example, in his discussion of organic and traditional intellectuals, Gramsci talks about industrialists as a kind of organic intellectual of the capitalist class, because what they do, forget about even how they talk about it, what they do helps to organize social life, and thus is an important part of the creation of hegemony. Now, coherence also implies incoherence as its dialectical opposite. And in that sense, if you have the task of organizing hegemony also has to do with disorganizing alternatives. For those interested in social movement theory, you can also think of Charles Tilly's term, or I mean, he came up with it, but loads of people use it, of repertoires as also a kind of coherence, but it's not usually theorized as a hegemonic project. Yet, if you read Tilly, for example, he'll talk about the ways in which the repertoire of the social movement, that is to say, what those sorts of performances that we now take as being what a social movement is, they are, it's a cluster of performances, public performances, that are not what passed as political contention in an earlier era, before states centralized a great deal, before the development of capitalism. Back in the day, you didn't want to pay taxes, you didn't go to Washington and have an anti-tax demonstration. You chased the tax collector out of town. Maybe you tarred and feathered the tax collector, but we don't do that anymore. And the fact that we don't do that anymore is directly tied to the development of a new kind of coherent set of contentious performances, but which Tilly also links to the development and centralization of states and capital. Finally, to praxis. If we're talking about the development of real potentials for alternative coherence, and now it's a little bit of a mouthful again, but you see where I've gone, then one of the things we have to do is we have to understand different modes of agency. We have to start to think about what it really means to act and act socially, and what it means to strategize. And I've done some work also with Colin Barker about strategizing as learning. And that is to say, again, that learning isn't just what happens in your head, it's a matter of how you internalize the organization around you. And of course, it's more complicated than that. But the idea behind this is that praxis implicates multiple levels of analysis. You act on one level, so for example, I'm part of a group that right now is trying to develop a certain kind of non-speculative housing in New York. I see Peter Marcuse there, he's also involved in it. And one of the main organizations involved in this is a group called Picture the Homeless, which is a homeless activist group. And there's I think what's interesting there is you have homeless people who are literally homeless, trying to act on the housing system in a way that would affect city policy. So there's a way in which it acts on an institution, there's action on an institutional level. But at the same time, one of the things that it does, of course, is that it tries to combat homelessness, the very conditions that enable them to identify themselves as homeless activists. So it operates, no matter what they say, whatever they say, they could be saying almost anything, that very action operates on a symbolic level as well. So there's a bunch of different ways in which we can analyze praxis, and because praxis always implicates multiple levels of analysis. It also, again, entails change in the actor themselves. Whoops. I'm actually going to stop here because I want to give Lawrence a chance. I have not too much left, but I've said really the most of what I want to say now. And I'm going to let Lawrence jump in because I do want to make sure that we have ample time for discussion.
So I was thinking I was going to speak from there, but I can't actually see everybody from there because I'm not as tall as Jeff, so I'll stand up here. So I'm talking really about joint work that I've been doing with Alf Nilsson from the University of Bergen around the question, the chapter in this book is called What Would a Marxist Theory of Social Movements Look Like? And Alf has twisted my arm to make me say we are now doing this as a book, which is called We Make Our Own History. So that's fairly programmatic. And we're coming, I should say, from a slightly different angle. There's a lot of different angles in this book. And ours is one of asking, I think E.P. Thompson said it, not so much are we on Marx's side, but is Marx on our side in our attempts to change society for the better, very broadly said. And the line we take is that in Marxism, as in a number of theories developed from social movements, feminism being a very obvious comparator, there is a kind of activist good sense, as Gramsci would put it, which has got frozen or congealed, has kind of drifted upwards into the academy and stays there in a slightly mystified form. So our kind of sort of broad slogan is recycle, reuse, reclaim. In other words, see what of this we can actually use today for our own movements. So when I'm talking about Marxism here, I'm not claiming that Marxism is the only way or is the only such form of popular theorizing grounded in experience about how movements work. I think it is a particularly important one, and it's maybe a particularly rich field to mine. Or we started there because it's the lazy option. So when we've been trying to think about this, and we've been trying to think what would a Marxist theory of movements look like, because there isn't the Marxist theory of social movements for a variety of reasons. There are many ways that you can read Marx and later Marxists on movements, many different approaches within it. Nonetheless, we think there are some things which are particularly present, let's say, in the best of Marxist theory and practice. But, you know, it's a construction, and we're not going to attempt to defend its orthodoxy. So here are three key propositions which I think are important. The first one, I guess, is that social movements are situated. So they're situated in relation to the needs, the life world, the practices, the resources, and so on of the people who make them. Yeah? They do not float free in a purely political realm. And in fact, one of the biggest problems that we've found looking at conventional theories of social movements is, to be a little bit polemic about it, they're quite American. They kind of assume that the state is sort of there, the polity is the way it is, and you're not going to do that much about it. And social movements operate as a level within this, which is different from the level on which labor unions or political parties, or for that matter, churches, or sabotage in the workplace, or whatever. Those are other kinds of things, because things are really quite fixed and quite stable, and social movement is this kind of thing. And I'm over-egging this for the purposes of polemic, but a bit the European experience is sometimes we have very little going on at all. And other times movements come out of nowhere and they actually overthrow the state. And they do it quite regularly. And they do it, within living memory. And we live in states which have been made and remade and shaped and reshaped by social movements. So that the idea of movement as a fixed level of activity is quite problematic. And I'll come back to that developmental aspect, the non-fixedness of movements. The third thing, and I think maybe politically it's the most important aspect of Marxism, is that it's not just us who are engaging in collective action. I mean, this was one of Stuart Hall's big statements, is class warfare is always coming from on top. One of the things that defines normality is that the powerful are winning. Their collective agency in a normal period is more effective, more consistent, more omnipresent and so on than ours. And revolutionary periods or cycles of contention or whatever are moments in which this changes. So we're interested in theorizing movements from above as well as from below. Not only, for example, when they install neoliberalism, but when they try and defend it, and in those really interesting moments when their collective ability to sustain a particular form of capitalism, or for that matter, a particular form of class society, is starting to wane and our agency can have particular effects. So, what I'm going to say now, though, is mostly about movements from below, and John has mentioned some of this, which is the question of looking at what is a real potential, what is possible for movements at a particular point in time, because this is absolutely crucial when you're trying to do them, is to go, what should we be spending our energies doing? This is the reason why Marx was interested in class analysis, and initially was say, who should we be talking to? Is there much point doing what apparently French theorists were doing, which was talking to elites? Are they actually the people we should be talking to if we want to bring about socialism? No. Right? And that was, it's not the only aspect of Marxist class analysis, but it's a fairly important one. Who should we be talking to? Where are we wasting our time? Where are we not wasting our time? So that question of real potentials. And it's a developmental question because the job of the activist is to try and move things on, is not just, and there's a certain kind of writing about movements which says, I really like what the Zapatistas are doing. It's great. If everybody did what they were doing, everything would be sorted, which is typically not much help, there is nothing wrong with celebrating the Zapatistas, but it's not a very constructive thing to do. It's cheering from the sidelines. So here's how we've theorized it in relation, and I'll talk about this in relation to a particular Irish problem, which is that we have a big natural gas pipeline being built by Shell. This is one of our key struggles at the moment in a place called Rossport, and we have fracking developing across much of the region close to it. So initially we say the kind of ground zero of the movement process is what we call local rationality, something like Gramsci's good sense, the way in which people live their lives, try and meet their needs, think about what they're doing. In this particular part of the country, which is an area of kind of small farmers and fishermen, they have a very clear idea that they are among the few people on the face of the planet who successfully got rid of the landlords. Yeah? Ireland is one of the very few places where we got rid of the aristocracy, the peasants got the land. They then changed. It was not, as wonderful as we had hoped. But people have this very, very strong sense, hey, we kicked them out. Them not being the Brits or whatever, but being the landlords, after a brutal famine and so on. And that is very, very central there. So when Shell came along and said, hey, we have these compulsory purchase orders, we're going to build our pipeline across your land, a lot of people said, actually, no, that rubs us up the wrong way. And they moved to what we call militant particularisms. David Harvey has picked up this term from Raymond Williams, who probably picked it up from somebody else, which is where something forces that local rationality actually kind of stand up for itself and argue. And what Shell did, they were very foolish. They put 5 of these people in jail. So you have this multinational company had put 5 small farmers, and they were very good at acting the part of, I'm a West of Ireland small farmer, and here I am in the jail, along with all the drug users. See me? I'm standing up for what I believe in. It was great. They were there for 3 months. Shell eventually had to, this was a contempt of court thing, so it was rather awkward. Shell actually had to say, okay, let them go. By which point, of course, they had dug themselves in so badly that nobody in that part of Ireland was going to accept their pipeline. So militant particularisms, you're not just situated, but you are fighting for your situatedness. And then we call it campaigns, you don't have to, but you start to recognize that there is something more universal about this situation. You abstract from that. And in this particular case, there was a rather dotty nun who had spent a lot of time in Ogoniland. She was one of the last people working with Ken Saro-Wiwa before Shell executed Saro-Wiwa and 8 other people. And she went round talking to these West of Ireland farmers about the Ogoni and about Shell. And then we had some Norwegian trade unionists as well from the oil unions. And they started talking about their struggles with Statoil, which was the second shareholder. And people started to go, okay, we are part of a global movement against extractive industries, and in particular against Shell, because Shell are very good at making themselves an enemy. But beyond that again, and this doesn't always happen yet, this is, sometimes Shell come along and do it for you, but sometimes you need an awful lot of work on the ground, you need dotty nuns, you need mad lefties, to make it happen. You start to see the possibility of a different kind of world, of an alternative sort of development. And this happened, of course, when we started to have Irish trade unionists and Republicans and anarchists and environmental activists all starting to muck in. And at that point, of course, you have to stand back from the specific issues of what is wrong with the oil industry and ask bigger questions about energy, about ownership of natural resources, about climate change. These are enormous vistas, and we're still only partway there. So movements are processes, and they're processes which don't just happen. There's nothing automatic about this. They're processes which activists try and move on. And this, in a sense, anybody here who's ever been in a campaign knows some of this is the ABC, is to start saying, what kind of thing is this like? Who can we ally with? Should we really take the offer that's on the table from the local power brokers? All these kinds of things, you recognize them. Which means, of course, that often people don't have to make it up for themselves for the first time, but they can learn from other campaigns. They can learn from Ogoni, or right now, some excellent activists are transferring what was learned in this village to the places which are facing fracking and going around telling people this is what it's like, these are the issues, these are the problems. So this is trying to develop a kind of Marxist theory of social movements which reflects that activist ABC, maybe in a slightly more abstract form, in one that has a theoretical value, but which also has a practical value in terms of, okay, oh, that's what I do now. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. So we'll just open up the floor to questions, comments. Do we have a mic to pass around?
There's one in the camera bag.
Oh, but that's in that bag.
Yeah,
no,
it's
but
not
that's
connected.
not.
Yeah.
The one on the table does have a long wire.
Oh, okay. So I can bring this mic almost as far as I can. Anyone? So because it's being recorded and live streamed, it would be helpful to, ask the question to the mic. So I can walk around. So anybody?
Yeah, it's on. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Now that we have my mentor in dialectics sitting here. I guess I didn't hear, Jeff, very little of what you had to say, so I'm mainly directing it at Mike. Do you think what is needed is a very self-conscious paradigm shift? In other words, if, you're kind of sounds like an additive or an alternative perspective in terms of your critique of the limitations of existing social movement theory. And if you think about the paradigm shift originally, I guess the conflict version of Marxism was used, not very dialectical. The emphasis was on empiricism, which already put things like totality and contradiction out of the ballpark. The inspiration was rational action and rational actor theory and organizational theory, none of which was particularly Marxist in the old dialectical sense. So what really is needed if the framework that you're suggesting, are you saying gets incorporated, supersedes? What has to get done?
And this is for me, I'm sorry. Yes? Or for Lawrence? No,
We'll start with you.
Okay, you said Mike, and that happens to me all the time because Michael Krinsky is a radical lawyer. I don't know if you know who he is, but
I
people,
do.
Yeah, people call me Mike all the time. You just did.
I see.
So I wasn't sure who it was directed to, but
It's
it's
okay.
okay. I figured it out.
Don't worry. Earlier today, I called him Oliver.
Okay, well, there you go. No, I mean, I certainly think that a paradigm shift would be a wonderful thing. I think that it would, but not just, of course, in the study of social movements. But I think that the other piece of this, and this is, I guess, the piece of the little talk that I decided not to talk about, was that one of the things that they're in social movement studies, and one of the things, one corner of it, has begun to say that a big shortcoming of the field is that it doesn't ask questions that are relevant to movements. That there's this enormous amount of social movement scholarship that really speaks very much to other scholars. And I think that's largely true, although I think that you can overdo some of that criticism, and I think people sometimes do, which is only to say this, that I think that there are lots of interesting and good pieces, but part of the paradigm shift has to be to think about how these pieces actually relate to each other. And we don't have all the pieces, but we have enough pieces to really think about, well, what do we actually, when we talk about framing, when we talk about political opportunities, how instead of having them simply be additive, can we understand what they're doing, how they work on multiple levels of analysis, how they implicate each other, how they're constituted by each other. And I think that's the thing that we tend to think of framing as one activity and organizing as another, and so that we have organizational studies, we have cultural studies, et cetera, but we don't actually think very much about how these relate, how these are implicated in each other, how they constitute each other. And I think that's part of what a paradigm shift would do. I think the other thing, though, again, having to do with having something to say also to movements, is that we shouldn't draw necessarily such a strong line between our own research and what activists are. We're always active in something, right? Gramsci's whole distinction between the organic and traditional intellectual is traditional intellectuals don't really realize that they're producing a certain kind of knowledge that isn't simply universally valid, but in making kinds of universal validity claims, they're active very often in ways that they don't understand in supporting the current configuration of power. So you're shaking your head, or?
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, you agree. I thought.
I agree with Mike. I don't know about John.
Oh, okay. I'll ask him. So I think that that's actually really important. That we have to be reflexive enough to understand what we're doing when we do social movement scholarship as well. And very often, because we don't actually ask that, we don't produce knowledge that's useful to push ahead and develop some of the evident contradictions that we live with. I guess, so, oh, I'm sorry, I need the mic.
Allow me to deliver it.
First, let me thank you for really stimulating a panel. But one thing I would have liked some attention given to on this particular subject is why Marx gives the attention he does to class, and particularly the working class, as a part of a discussion of the subject before us today. And it has to do with, first of all, the fact that people who work for a living, who have to look for a job because they need to be able to make money in order to survive, that this gives them a kind of zero-sum relationship with the capitalist class, which becomes particularly strained periodically in crises. And these people are, despite the attempts of capitalists and their hirelings, Marx's phrase, to treat either classes not existing anymore in America or being very small because they associated only with the industrial working class. Class is a greater majority now in the United States than it ever was. And a whole number of people who were independent farmers and independent professionals now find that they're working for somebody and have to find a job in that area or in another area in order to survive. And these people all have a class interest as members of this class, though they may also have interests, important interests, in one other problem or situation, condition that they suffer from, or enjoy, which makes them active in a social movement. But the great majority of the people in all the social movements have to find a job in order to survive, and therefore are part of this larger working class, which represents the great majority of the society. So it's only insofar as people begin to understand that identity that they have is being a worker, a member of the working class, along with whatever other identities they may have, which may also require action, and that this identity is the one which allows them to think of themselves as the great majority, and which opens up the question of a political party, which is a phrase that I don't remember hearing in today's talks. And a political party is something that Marx emphasized again and again, an independent political party of the working class, which would serve working class major interests as being the necessary transition to doing anything which would go beyond limited and periodic reforms, which are important because they help certain people live a little better, but which don't do away with the basic relationships, which you did such a nice job in talking about earlier. And
if you're who I think you are, then you're partly responsible.
Oh, well, thank you. I think I am who I think I am.
You're Bertel Ullman, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yes.
So I would ask for a little attention, maybe. Sorry, I would ask for a little attention, really from all of you, about what you think about why class is so important, because that was sort of assumed, and that needs to get some attention, and then whether that calls for us to begin to think, or at least talk about, the need for a working class political party.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, I said I wanted to take this one because it's something I'm interested in. I mean, I think absolutely key to any Marxist take on social movements has to be that people are materially situated in all sorts of different ways. And that material situation includes not only the political economy of capital, let's say, but the kinds of things which socialist feminists have looked at in relation to the economies of care. It includes the racialized divisions of labor and so on. But Marx also pays an awful lot of attention to the different kinds of situations which working class people are in. And the extent to which, for example, the manifesto talks about the ways in which the generation of very large factories and concentration of labor and increased communication enables particular kinds of action. So while there is a general proposition about interest, there is also a proposition about the situations under which people are capable of coming to recognize and act on that interest, which I think is really important. There is quite a challenging claim that Marx makes, which I think he may be right in, but I'm not sure how he would ever go about proving it, which is, along with the proposition that the working class have the greatest interest in overthrowing the capitalist system, that working class organization has the capacity for a kind of rationality, which, for example, medieval peasants didn't have. Now, from my own experience, I think there is truth in that. It's quite challenging, and again, it poses this question of, let's talk about an immense diversity, actually, the conditions under which working class people are capable of coming to organize and act in rational ways, which, one of the difficulties of our present period is that it's actually bloody hard for them to do so, for whatever reason. One of the aspects of that is indeed parties, but it's important to say that party, even in Marx, at the time Marx died, meant something very, very different to what it does now. When the word party is put into the title of the manifesto, there is nothing remotely like even the Bolshevik Party or the SPD, never mind today's political parties. And the core proposition is that there should be not a party separate from all the other parties, as he puts it, but certainly a discussion, a space for discussion, an organ, an institution in which this rationality somehow expresses itself, but not separate from movements and not trying to take over movements, but that there are people within movements who are arguing we have to move forward, as against the people who are saying, no, we're only going to fight for white workers, or we're only going to fight for Catholics, or whatever it is, that those arguments need to be fought for and that you need to support each other in doing that. I think one of our difficulties at the present time is finding a space outside of the academy in which we can do that. We have lots of people.
I had Peter's hand, Peter's hand first, and then I've got two in the back, so. Oh, three in the back, okay. So.
I'm sorry I missed all of the talks, but it seems to me that the contribution in the two that I did hear is very strong in making the point of the complexity of the analysis that's involved. I was sort of waiting for John's last slide, which I thought maybe would put everything together, but I'd like to raise the question of whether we're not asking the wrong question, whether it seems to me social movements is in a way an incoherent category, in the sense in which Manuel Castells, when he got into the urban sociology, argued that urban sociology was an incoherent category. That if you were to push the analysis, I think Marx would be useful in a way that the class issue raises very sharply, that is, in defining what we mean by the term, or when whatever it does mean surfaces as a real concern. Are hunters a category of social movement? Are cancer sufferers a social movement? Is the Tea Party a social movement? Are African Americans a social movement? Are whites a social movement? There was one term that was used in the discussion that I think is critical, and that is the term below. That the unifying meat underneath the concept of social movements is movements from below. And that raises a set of questions that I think Marx would be extremely useful on. And in particular, just very crudely, it seems to me concepts like exploitation, and in what sense have social movements reacted to a different form of exploitation than the labor movement has reacted to? That there's a set of categories in Marx that would be useful once you get beyond trying to figure out what social movements are and see what role they play in a larger totality, if one wanted to use that term.
Do you want to take the from below and then, or Jeff, do you want to chime in?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. I mean, there's actually a huge literature on social movements and their definition, and I don't think anyone's proposed that social movements are simply categories or classes of people per se, which is what you seem to be suggesting. As far as I know, no one would say African Americans or cancer sufferers are a social movement. The concept refers to people in struggle with some organization acting outside of kind of normal institutionalized politics and, drawing on self-categorizations, self-classifications, that is to say, identities. And so, yes, people may mobilize on the basis of being African American or suffering from cancer, although those categories are obviously not social movements. So I was a little, I was a bit confused by the comment. It seems to me that there are, that it's not an incoherent category, and although, like any category, it's, fuzzy around the edges, and when does a movement become a political party, or are there collective formations that are both movements and parties at times? These are certainly serious questions to be asked. But I think we've learned quite a lot, actually. The literature's quite rich about how social movements work. My beef is that we just haven't learned as much as we could if we took some Marxist concepts a little more seriously. But since these have been largely driven out of the academy, or at least driven out of the social movements field, that this corner of scholarship has suffered heavily from that move. But we know a lot more than we did 30 years ago about popular movements, mass movements, social movements, and I hope our analyses will get better, and I think they will get better when folks take Marxism more seriously. How that will happen, I don't know. I think it's going to be largely dependent on what happens outside the walls of the academy. In other words, the academy's always lagging behind. I think the real world, if I can use that expression, always lagging badly behind. But you know, if class struggles from below become a lot more important than they are now, then I think these ideas this tradition will be rediscovered not only by activists and ordinary people, but eventually by people with PhDs. That's my hope.
Much as I'm tempted to go back to that question and also to others, I think we'll just keep it going for a bit. I've got some in the back. We'll get to you. Oh, whoops. I'm taking all the microphones with me now. I'm getting too enthusiastic.
Yes, my name is William, and I'm going to be hopefully respectfully a little provocative with all due love for everybody. But I guess, you know, the one thing I guess I find missing is Marx also wrote a lot about crisis. And it feels like we're in a crisis right now. For some people, a very serious crisis, you know. For some, not so much. For me, not so much. And Marx also wrote a lot about transformation and sort of going beyond reformism. But, you know, so I guess when I came here, I expected a little more fireworks about that, about situating ourselves in the present moment and the crises we're facing, you know, environmental, work, debt, you name it, you know, suicide rates going up, homeless, blah, 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 everything that flies over Facebook. But I don't feel like that element of Marx came out here, and often I feel like it doesn't really. We're very kind of scholastic about the way we deal with Marxism and crisis. And in terms of transformation, I found in just dipping into the social movements literature, but, you know, Jeff has written about this, is that a lot of it's very reformist, inclusionary. You know, if we can just get a raise for Wisconsin workers, that'll be it, man. We'll be on the road. But I just don't see, especially with climate and the ecological crisis, that really gets us where we want to go, or that is what Marx would support. So I'm just wondering how there's this disconnect between a social movement studies and a Marxist studies that seems so distant from the real struggles out there, you know, in many cases when we go, you know, hear about things and no sort of bloodless, you know, and how do we get to such a bloodless point where, you know, if I went to a Tea Party meeting, I think it would be it wouldn't be academic maybe, but other meetings on the right, it'd be pretty lively about the state is strangling us and how do we get them off our back or whatever.
Well, I'm going to respond provocatively because I'd say the opposite. I'd say if you look at Marxist books or Marxist-inspired books, there is a much bigger market for things which say, things are terrible. Yeah? You can sell wonderful books which say, things are terrible, and which go into incredible theoretical demonstrations of both how hip you are and how smart you are, and proving just how awful things are. Now, Marx liked to polemic as much as the next person, actually rather more than most of the next people. But the problem with that, and particularly the problem when you have the right in power, you know, including our, you know, current beloved governors, is that doesn't actually tell you what to do. And in fact, quite often it reinforces you in going, see how smart I am? I can see just how bad things are. And in fact, I can tell you how awful things are and how little we can possibly do about them. Now, there is a big market for that. When we're organizing, that's not the space we're in. When we're organizing, the space we're in is what can we realistically hope to do? John's point about real potential. Realistically does not necessarily mean reformist. It does mean going, is this one of those moments in which we can hope to take the bastards? Yeah? Because there's a cost to trying to do so and failing. Yeah? And that cost is often very bloody and very, very personal. Yeah? If we want to try and take them, we want to be reasonably sure that we're going to have a decent number of people on our side, and that, for example, the police and the military are mostly going to go, you know what? I think these guys are right. Yeah? And we've seen this happen fairly recently. We know what that looks like. So it's a stylistic pose to be saying, every time there's a public meeting, revolution now. It is not a stylistic pose to be saying, we need to be allying with these people. Yeah? And to be quite upfront and saying, you're not, let's say in these kind of Irish villages that I'm talking about, where people are, they're not necessarily all nice people. They're quite used to getting rid of nomad populations, Irish travellers, by talking to their local county councillors. And the kind of person who does that is quite likely to think, if I talk to my county councillor, can we get rid of the oil companies as well? So what you do in that point as a practical revolutionary is you say, well, actually, that's not going to work. You explain why it's not going to work, and you say, do you know, if you want to defeat these people, you're going to have to make some very uncomfortable allies. Yeah? And allies that are going to get you vilified in public and that are going to make you, and you have to actually help people move along that step. That's quite difficult. I'll leave it at that.
We'll have one and then we'll get to the front.
And there's one more.
Oh, boy. All right. Well, we'll jump around a little because they've been patient too. So go ahead.
Hello, my name is Marissa. So I had a couple of questions. I wanted to know your opinion on why the occupant movement did not create long-lasting change, why it seems to have disappeared. I know that it's still going on, but I feel as if there could have been a very strong revolution and change in that the military kind of stifled it. And I just wanted to know what your opinion was. And then also, do you feel that our generation, meaning 19 to 30-year-olds, need a face in order to fight for change? And not just, temporary change, but long-lasting change, affecting the foundations of what America was built on. And why, in your opinion, do you feel that young people are not making any effective change in government?
Wow, that's a pretty depressing set of questions. But I want to challenge a little bit of the premise of the first one. I think that to understand Occupy, this is at least the way I think about it, and it's from a very limited point of view because, for everything else, I'm a terrible provincial, and I only really try to find out about stuff that's going on in New York. And the rest sort of happens, but I can't focus on too much at once. But I think that it's a mistake to see Occupy as something that started in September and ended in November. There were a whole load of strands that fed into Occupy Wall Street, and then that got and then they got diffused in very different ways in different places. But it was not a simple creation of adbusters. It wasn't a creation of what I like to think of because I'm no longer 19 to 30 as the Occupy kids. There was a lot else going on. It was very multi-generational. To the extent that it grew partly, I think, in a very contingent way, having to do actually with a group of people from Occupy that decided to go up on a march and join the demonstrations against Troy Davis's execution, because that's when they were first attacked by the cops, and that's what went viral. And I think that was actually a very important moment. It was an important moment on a number of different levels, but most of the people there in Union Square who were talking about Troy Davis were not Occupy people. And yet their activity was crucial, I think, in the growth of Occupy. Not only that, though, but before Occupy, there had been Bloombergville. Some of the same people had been involved in Bloombergville. It was much smaller. It didn't grow. Maybe it demonstrated to some people the real potential of doing this again and trying it again. They didn't say Bloombergville was an abject failure just because city council ended up passing the crappy budget, right? So part of this has to do with how you understand what the thing is. And what I would do is I would urge a view on the thing that is Occupy as having a much broader both organizational and temporal set of relations that congeal within it. That being said, too, I think that there's a great deal of both activism around the city and activists who were whose work was either given a temporary boost by Occupy or who became active during Occupy with a vocabulary that's associated with it. I think that this whole issue of that I pointed to about coherence, something that actually did sort of cohere from Occupy was a real change in the terms of debate about inequality in this country, and it's been lasting. It hasn't been everything that anybody could want, but the fact that people still are talking very clearly about the 99% and the 1%, that's not what was happening before 2011 by a long shot for a lot of people. And so to think about Occupy failing, I think is to start off in the wrong place. So that's my sort of quasi-optimistic answer. But of course, it was also really repressed. And we shouldn't be surprised that it was repressed for precisely the reasons that Lawrence just talked about. As for the 19 to 30-year-olds, again, I don't know why I draw boundaries around them. I've got kids. They're 14 and 11. Why not them, right? I don't see why, I honestly think that we are involved in something that has to be a multi-generational fight, but that we also keep getting older. So that multi-generational thing is a moving target. Like everything else, it develops. Oddly enough, I'm no longer 19 to 30. It happens. But I say that, part of it, to sort of make sense of this for myself, that question for myself right now, there's a way in which some piece of this book developed when I met Colin Barker, who's now, 75 or so? And I met him almost 20 years ago. So when I was 19 to 30. So the point is that a lot of these things also take a great deal of time. And so attaching yourself to a generation, I understand the appeal to that, but attaching yourself to a generation is slippery business.
I was mentioning just my generation and referring to, civil rights movement, people that were younger, how they were able to make effective change because perhaps they had a face that they're able to look at that told them, that gave them power to say, we can make a change. And I was saying this generation, my generation, doesn't have a face. And I'm wondering if that's the reason why it's difficult for people to get out of their comfort zone and make change. I wasn't saying that, I wasn't saying that not everybody can make a change. I was just talking about my generation specifically, because we are the ones that are going to be in power soon, going to make changes in law, going to be in the office. So I feel like now is a time to make some kind of effective change.
I agree with John in many ways. I disagree with him in some ways about Occupy. And in answering the question, I want to kind of open it up to this bigger question of revolution or transformation that Marx wrote about. I certainly agree with John that in one sense, the Occupy movement was spectacularly successful in becoming a movement when that really wasn't the expectation of the people who went down to Wall Street that day, and many of them have said this. They thought, well, they'd be down there for a few days, get arrested, But a movement, a persistent movement, and one that spread across the country in the way it did, this was, of course, completely unanticipated. So the movement was, in a sense, unintended, unintentional, a surprise, a delightful surprise to many of us, especially in its analysis of this class divide between the 1%, the 99%. Even if we could think of other ways to express that, it seemed to resonate with widespread feeling in the country that elites, capitalists, and their henchmen have far too much power, and we've known actually polls long predating Occupy have shown that that's a persistent belief of Americans. Didn't start with Occupy, that particular feeling. I think the movement, though, was unable, for reasons that we can analyze and discuss for a long time, it was simply unable to develop the structural power of working people in this country. Which gets back to Bertel's question about, well, what is it about the working class that was so important for Marx? And, it was this idea that the working class, and really only the working class, has the capacity to, because society depends on its labor, to use this as leverage against our rulers. And Occupy just, again, there are many reasons why, but Occupy wasn't able to leverage that power. Occupying parks across the country just did not put the screws on elites in a way that leveraging the power of work, more specifically withdrawing one's work from the system, could have done. But it's not over till it's over, and so in that sense, Occupy was a important and educational defeat. Let's put it that way. It was a defeat. There's no way around it. But that's nothing new. All movements go through a series of tactical victories and defeats, and you simply try to learn along the way. And I hope what people learn is that, you need a different tactical approach to change this society than occupying public parks, which is fantastic at perhaps spreading your message, winning some allies, creating a public spectacle in the best sense of the word that get your message out, but at the end of the day, it puts no pressure at all, really, on the people who run the country. That requires a different, I think, set of tactics, which, as I say, would leverage this structural power of working people, the structural power that comes from their collective labor in the society.
My name is Constance, and I have several questions, but I'll make it very quick. To the gentleman that just spoke, you mentioned that things were ignored now about Marxism, and if you could address the things that were ignored, that's one question, just slightly. And then the next question is when you spoke, our chairman, John, when you said that the different disciplines in academia were not speaking to each other and they identified the problem differently. That was the question to you. And then the gentleman over here, so we have not identified what this group of people, are the cancer victims or, the different groups in our society. That the last time I think that the populace made a difference was during the Vietnam War. And it came from all classes, and it was the draft. You know, everybody was threatened. Their children were going. And that's what got everybody really agitated. I was in Berkeley at that time. I mean, it was certainly integration and gender identification, but the draft was the big thing, and everybody from, you know, whether it was Piedmont or Greenwich or Hillsborough, whatever, everybody was upset about that. And so if you could answer those, please. And then to identify people in the public, the group. Thank you.
I mean, I think that just basically what I was trying to get at when I was talking about whether it was disciplines not speaking to each other, or even within the discipline of even within the disciplines of sociology and political science, and the very limited subdiscipline of social movement studies, there's a range of different explanations that that tend to take a piece of the puzzle. We then learn quite a bit about that piece of the puzzle, but don't tie it to any other part of the explanation in any kind of satisfactory way. And they don't. But, right, that's right, they don't. And I think that they don't because they see these dynamics as really discrete from each other rather than, as really as puzzle pieces, rather than as related to each other in very integral ways. Let me just stop there and pass it on. What kinds of things from Marxism have been ignored?
Where to start? Class struggle,
exploitation, I think,
exploitation, crisis, which someone mentioned, the structural power of capital, the structural power of labor. I mean, Marxism as such has been ignored with its rich traditions and array of categories. That was the point I was getting at. And if we didn't talk about Marx on crises, well, we can't mention everything in 15 minutes. We didn't talk about his theory of revolution and a lot of stuff. We had more, I think, limited purpose. There's a huge literature now on the climate and climate crisis, ecological crisis, and its, shall we say, intimate relationship with capitalism. We could have talked about all that and a whole lot more, but we had limited time and purpose here. I don't know. Is that? So everything about Marxism has been ignored in this corner of the academy these days. And it's the book is John and Lawrence can correct me if they see it a little differently, but I think the book is kind of a collective plea to people who would analyze movements, whether they're scholars, activists, ordinary readers, to take this tradition very seriously, even if the professoriate has not.
Yeah, I mean, I just again on the book, because after all, that is sort of what brought us together. There are 19 chapters in the book that speak about, I mean, if we just do a quick rundown of things, there's class struggle, and there's a chapter on class struggle and social movements, which does take up some of these questions, especially in questions also of exploitation. We've got Contesting the Post-Colonial Development Project, a Marxist perspective on popular resistance in the Narmada Valley. So that also you can immediately tell sort of that deals partly with environmental issues, but also it deals with questions of racism and indigenous people and Dalits in India. So there's already you can see that this perspective helps to tie a bunch of different things together. defending place, remaking space, social movements in Oaxaca and Chiapas. Again, I think one of the interesting things also about Occupy has to do with claims on public space. So that even though it raises a discussion about who has the right to public space in the city or to space at all in the city. There's work on caste, there's work on right-wing social movements. There's work on C.L.R. James's History of the Pan-African Revolt, the global justice movement, regeneration schemes in poor areas of Scotland and the sort of language that attends to them. So it's a quite rich set of chapters, many of which actually do some of the work that I think William referred to, if not necessarily always, and some of them actually get a little more polemical than we've been. But I wouldn't say that, I'm sorry if you found this bloodless, but I wouldn't say that the chapters in the book are bloodless. I don't think they're bloody either, but it's somewhere in between. You had a...
I want to pick up on what Jeff just said about structural leverage and bring it back to a couple of things that Lawrence said earlier about we need to propose things that are practical, and a comment that he made that I think is really important about saying to people, you might have to ally with some folks that you're not comfortable with, and then invoke John's longer discourse about contradiction. I think all those are all tied together, and I think that the idea of contradiction is really the central idea that really needs to be messaged into the social movement theory, because it is the contradictions within the various structures that provide the leverage that Jeff was talking about. And I think that what people have to do who are organizers, or either of themselves or other people, is to have the lens that says, let's look at the contradictions in the situation that allow us to generate leverage, and that means looking for allies who, if we work together, can actually generate that leverage that will allow to leverage the social change. And I want to just push Jeff's point a little further. It's not just the simple way in which people work in industrial or productive capacities. There's a lot of different structures in which there are contradictions that create vulnerabilities. I think Tahrir Square is a very good example of that, whereas Jeff might be right that taking over a public park in New York is not really going to generate any leverage, but taking over Tahrir Square did generate a lot of leverage. The biggest industry in Egypt is tourism. Taking over that public park wiped out tourism almost instantly. It put the whole capitalist class of Egypt back on its heels within a few days. And then, of course, they were able to claim allies among the working class. So now the shutdown of the Suez Canal, or the threatened shutdown of the Suez Canal, generated more leverage. So I think we have to be very creative about understanding how you can generate leverage, and people have to be very creative about understanding what their role is in society that allows them to exercise leverage if they can only get together and ally with the key people that are going to allow them to generate it.
Yeah, I mean, is it okay if I? Yeah, go ahead. One of the things which any 20th century Marxist would have instantly recognized as bourgeois scholarship in social movements research is the way you start by saying, I am going to do a thesis on the X movement. And you have determined from the get-go that there is this thing, which is the X movement, be it defined by an issue, by an identity, as the gentleman over here was saying, and that is the unit of analysis. Because what you are doing, if you are halfway worth your salt as an activist in any movement, is you are saying, no, we are not just about, in France in '68, men and women students having access to each other's dorms. Yeah? We are not just about the right of peasants to collect wood in the forest or whatever. It's about actually changing the boundaries. And there are no terms, really, within social movement scholarship for even discussing what the boundaries of a movement are. But this is one of the absolutely key issues when you get together. Are we just fighting this gas pipeline? Are we fighting Shell? Are we fighting capitalism? Are we fighting an ecologically destructive civilization? Who are we? Are we part of the environmental movement? Are we part of the left? That argument, which you can go off on many, cultural and linguistic tacks, but it's a hugely political argument about who do we ally with, how do we organize, what do we thematize, what are we trying to get. That's central to movements. And that's why movements, I want to come back to one other thing that's said. This is why movements move, because one of the things most obvious about social movement scholarship is it doesn't actually allow the movements to move anywhere. Yeah. They're supposed to be this kind of thing. And if you look at the way people have talked, be it about Occupy, be it about the Arab Spring or whatever, it's kind of as if they're talking about, I don't know, Coke's latest ad campaign. Well, it's not a thing because people didn't do exactly the same thing everywhere, or not everybody bought this thing. As though, I don't know, 1968 looked like that, or resistance to fascism looked like that, or the revolutions at the end of the First World War, or come to that, the Atlantic revolutions, that somehow everybody was doing the same thing, and when enough people were doing the same thing, everybody said, oh yeah, we'll do that thing too. So we also have to, and this is one of the key things that Marxism brings, I think, is to have some kind of historical sense of what it actually does look like when things start to shift, as opposed to a commercial idea of what it ought to look like, which is completely unreal.
I think just one other just addition to that, though. One of the projects I'm working on is a book on the people who clean New York City's parks, and one of the things that strikes me is there was a campaign to organize the nonprofit workers, or rather the workers for the Central Park Conservancy, which is a nonprofit that has a contract to run Central Park. It failed. At no time during the campaign did the union try to mobilize support among volunteers, of which there are many in Central Park, who are also, it must be said, working for free. They like to think of themselves as giving back to the community, but they're also working for free. But we don't tend to thematize volunteering as work. We thematize it as civic engagement. And so I wouldn't say that only academics are guilty of this, right? Activists are very often guilty of the same thing, of saying they're not part of the movement that we're part of. They're not part of our activism. Those people there are irrelevant to us, or they'll never, or without even trying, they'll never ally with us. And you don't know that, and you don't know about what real potentials are until you test the waters, until you try. And I think that that's another piece of this, is that agency, part of agency lies in trying, because you never know. You can have a good idea sometimes, but similarly, I mean, there's loads of accounts of. I mean, Gramsci has a wonderful account of factory occupations where the Sassari Brigade happened to be the Sassari Brigade from Sardinia, came to put down the strikes in Turin, and it turned out that the workers in Turin ended up passing cigarettes to their Sardinian brethren, because the workers in Turin were also from Sardinia. And they had to withdraw, the forces of reaction had to withdraw the Sassari Brigade in the middle of the night because there was no way on earth that they thought that they could keep control of them. So sometimes it makes sense to reach out to the repressive apparatus. Sometimes it doesn't. You can get burned. You need to know the difference sometimes, that's all. But you don't know what real potentials are until you try. Go ahead.
Something that Lawrence was talking about, like acknowledging that, class warfare goes both ways and they're always mostly winning. And to what extent does the analysis of sort of the rise of the nonprofit industrial complex as, one more way that the elites pay the working class to fight on the terms that are acceptable to the elites? Because it seems like it's also related to this idea that people focus more on their identity, that they are a particular kind of activists. And even I see people contest that when they say, oh, I do this work and they do that work, but they don't say, well, really, I'm an anti-capitalist activist and I do this stuff. You barely see that pop up. So to what extent is that a global problem? I mean, I know it's definitely an American problem, but what are some effective ways of acknowledging that, and which also involves, calling out our friends and ourselves, and looking for more non-co-opted ways. And I just had a really quick comment on Occupy. I think, I got involved in Occupy upstate when they got evicted and helped start, a housing organization out of it. And I think there's a lot of, once we threw everyone up and then settled down, there's a lot of kind of sleeper cells that are doing their own work, but are also still remember where they came from or what strengthened them.
If I may, I think both are right. I think that I'd actually love Lawrence to answer part of this with respect to this idea of social movements from above, because I think that it's actually a very important kind of concept as well, and the thematization of it in the book, I think, is also really important. But with respect to the nonprofit industrial complex, as you call it, I think there's a lot of different stuff that goes on within nonprofits, and not all of it is necessarily really acceptable to the so-called powers that be. I think that the more pointed question has to do with doing things like raising the questions about, well, what do we do? What are we doing when we're sending students to unpaid internships in nonprofits? What are we doing? What else are they learning apart from what's in their internship about the value of work? What are they learning about how you enter the workforce? So we have to start thinking about how there's a great amount of work that's done, volunteer work, as well as more coerced work like workfare, that isn't thematized as such. Because if we understand some of that as work and then start to understand the relationship across different kinds of labor relations, and this is my hobby horse here, then we start to really broaden our understanding of who the heck is in the working class and what's going on with the working class, and why is it that so many people who are working and whose work is being exploited don't think of themselves for a minute as being exploited. That to me is, I think, even more an issue. And then you can talk about what goes on in the nonprofit, what goes on when you hire a nonprofit organizer for $25,000 a year and expect them to live at home. I remember seeing that too, or $16,000 a year. People who are working full time for a tenant organizing group who can't leave their parents' house because they simply can't afford a place to live. There might be a problem with that too, but how you solve that outside of the nonprofit industrial complex, which still protects some of that organization's money from taxation, is a difficult nut to crack. But it's worth asking and it's worth raising.
There's a lot of big questions there. I think I'll try and say something about each of them briefly. I think on identities, one of the difficulties, certainly in Britain and Ireland, is that Marxism became an identity post-60s for a certain kind of white man. Yeah? Now, what I do for a living, I work with activists from a very, very wide range of groups. And what I find is they love me when I act in Marxist ways. In other words, bring activists together from different groups. They hate me when I spout Marxism. Yeah? So, this is the useful thing to do, is to bring activists together. It's one of the things that I guess things like the World Social Forum have kind of pioneered as well, is ways of going, we do not have to have a single organization which everybody is in, where we all speak the same language. We have to have some way of, somebody called it an ecology of knowledges. But it's been one of the advantages of some of our solidarity struggles is when you have 5 families in jail, you can actually let go of who runs the campaign, and you can go, okay, we are all actually practically working together, and put a lot of the kind of battles for verbal leadership on one side. So I think we can learn something from cases in which the battle for identities has not taken us over, and why is that, and to what extent can we control that? Look, of course they co-opt NGOs. What else are they going to do? They did it with unions, they did it with parties. And we have a slightly different problem in Ireland in a good way, because our NGOs are funded not by private foundations but by the state. Like our unions, they went into partnership with the state. The state has now unilaterally broken that contract. This is, of course, quite a good thing from a Marxist point of view, but it's a bad thing if you're working for one of these. And quite often people are working for an NGO, their politics are to the left of it, but it puts bread on the table. And it's a very interesting space where you go, if that particular form has now fallen apart, the state is no longer funding it, can they remake themselves as activist organizations? Or is that even the problem? Because, if you come back to the question, let's say, of the general strike, rarely are effective general strikes decided at Union Central. Yeah? Union Central comes along at a certain point in a certain kind of country, a certain kind of labor regime, and goes, yeah, we are behind this. So there is a relationship between the official structure of our movements, the official organizations, in a sense that there is a dialectic between movement and organization. And one of the problems of the Marxist tradition, particularly in the 20th century, has been investing so heavily in the organization that when the organization got taken over, you had nowhere else to stand. And this is one reason why the traditions that are growing on the left are traditions which do not invest as heavily, do not put all their eggs in a single organizational basket, because we've seen where that goes. Very lastly, for me anyway, social movements from above. The book I'm working on, we've entitled it The Twilight of Neoliberalism, because one of the things you see when you look at the agency of them up there is it's actually quite a problem to hold together something like neoliberalism or Fordism or fascism. These are complicated coalitions which often start out with quite an oomph, and by the end they're quite brittle. They find it hard to react. And in some ways, I didn't say this during the talk because we could just have spent the whole time talking about that. I think the problem is not so much is neoliberalism going to fall apart, because such arrangements do, and they do with, pretty predictable regularity. It's what comes next. And to what extent can we make a difference in what comes next? Or will it be like the last time, where something is going to come out of right field and say, we're the new way forward, and we'll all be going, oh, shit. Yeah.
I think on that note, we're slightly over time, and I will simply invite everybody to, or anybody who wants to find a local bar and join us for a drink. And thank you for coming and staying throughout.
We had 3 copies of this book here at the start. Now we have 2.
Uh-oh.
Informal action has been each day.
I'm in trouble. I'm hoping there's...
Does he want them back?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. They're not mine.
That would be an example of going across.
It would, absolutely. Yeah.
Students that want to go into their.
He might. Yeah, I don't. Thanks.
Here's the thing, is that we have, I don't think we can Oh, so, but they can be ordered. Ordered for me. They can be ordered from Kmart. They just have to them today. So.
Maybe that's once a word.
No, I will. I'll tell you, there's stuff I've done some stuff labor, mostly labor. The one part
Not to be seen.
That?
Not to be seen.
You know what? And maybe we can stay in touch. Yeah. So stay in touch. So send me an
political science and urban planning. I work in Tehran and after I'm researching the space in other places, the public spaces, how the state disposes of the people, the basic qualities, policy of that.
Right, to get rid of that space. Right, I understand. Right, you can buy resource spaces.
So you do have this
Not in that sense. Not in that sense. But Alf has. Yes, I mean that's. But what he's talking about is actually like this village that's like uprooting. So generate. But actually, no, you know what I want to talk about? This Peskin's piece on Oaxaca and Peskin. It's in the book. It's the article on, it's one of the articles on next. I think it has something quickly. It's now been a while since I read all the pieces. But you know, sorry, are you studying anywhere or you?
No, I'm just researching and I came here to participate in CSW. Yeah, and so I just should take the chance to,
I think if you want that, but they're flexible. They want people to
So I want to start my let me give my it's a very simple because I did it here because I like it, yes. One of my languages, so just have it. It's very simple. Just see,
So research.
in urban planning,
Yes.
in
Oh, this is
so
great.
women.
So let me just write it down.
see what.
So
collect my things.